another edition of Gov Tech Today. I'm Russell Lowery.
And I'm Jen Saha.
And together we try and bridge the gap between .com and .gov. Perhaps in bridging that gap between .com and .gov, maybe there's not as much gap when it comes to lawyers getting together and talking about terms and conditions on a contract. I mean, it's at least language
chills
that
up my spine.
It's at least language that people are familiar with. But they weren't necessarily on the same side on every issue. And I hope to pick your brain a little bit in this episode as CDT has released new terms and conditions. So what's that mean for the business community in dealing with the state?
So this is long awaited. I think the vendor community, even state people who use these terms and conditions, have been pushing DGS and CDT to make things simpler, make them less confusing for many, many years. Like this dates, I remember sitting in meetings in 2018 on this exact issue and like pulling together the vendor community with redlining the current versions. So it's been a while. And just recently, honestly, like without much ado, DGS dropped new terms and conditions for IT contracts. So this applies to anything IT, goods or services. The contract number is GSPD 401 IT. And they made some changes. I love it when government asks, what are the problems? What do you guys see as problems? And then listens. Like, it's beautiful.
They released over a year ago, they released a draft. And I remember sitting in an auditorium. You were there. A who's who of the vendor community was there. They presented the draft, and then there were a lot of comments. and they answered some questions. And I noted that the panelists who were senior people at CDT were taking notes. Lawyers were listening. Is it evident, based on your expert opinion, that the changes that people brought up at that public meeting were actually incorporated into the regs?
So some of them certainly were. I think one of the big problems, the state of California has limited liability for a long time. So, you hear, well, unlimited liability, we can't bid on that. And it's true. Like, it's a big problem in a lot of jurisdictions. California has limited liability pretty well in the past. The one area that was sort of a carve out unknown was for cybersecurity, right? So if there's a breach, previous terms and conditions meant that the vendor was liable unlimited, which could be massive, right? And like small companies, they're willing to assume that risk because it's like, fine, sue us. We're only worth a couple $1 million. But like, a Fortune 100 company that's bidding on something is like, I can't bid on that. I can't put my entire, multi-billion-dollar corporation at risk for this contract at the state of California.
Right.
It was something we heard loud and clear in that meeting, and something the state was kind of apprehensive to like rein in. They were like, this could be massive. We have a lot of citizens. These contracts are a lot.
I remember listening to that section, and I thought the state was pretty clear that's not changing.
It changed.
That was the clear indication. We hear you. I understand that that's not changing. And then
it changed. So first of all, they simplified things. There used to be a set of cloud computing special provisions, one set for infrastructure, one set for platform, and one set for SaaS software. So 3 sets, and it was super confusing. Like even departments were like, am I buying software or infrastructure? What's the difference between infrastructure and platform? Like, I don't understand why this version says this and that. It was confusing for technologists. It was confusing for the vendor community. So they consolidated those down into one document that is now called Cloud Computing Services. So basically the decision is this cloud or not cloud? And if it's cloud, you have one set of provisions. If it's not cloud, you have another. So that simplifies a lot of things. It eliminates a lot of confusion. And back to the big win, the cybersecurity. So the limitation of liability related to caps for direct costs for data breaches is now in place with these new terms and conditions.
So if there's a cybersecurity event, somebody gets hacked, and is this covering like a ransom payment? Or
so it's basically, as long as a company isn't criminally liable for something, right? Like
Right.
you're, nefariously working with Russian actors or
Right.
something, then you're covered. Your liability is limited.
Okay.
And frankly, the vendor community doesn't care what it's limited to. They just need some kind of limit.
I'm
Like
not
they
putting
need,
my entire company at
right.
risk. I can't. My lawyers are not doing that. My board of directors are not doing it. It's an impossible hurdle. But
back to how you started. Get a bunch of lawyers in the room. They're going to be like, sorry, no way.
Got
Right.
it. So now there's a cap. Do you know the details of the cap, or do we have to go look at it?
They're all in the terms and conditions. What the Department of General Services did, which I love, is they released, in addition to the new terms, a whole play-by-play. Like, here's what we heard from the vendor community. Here's how we responded. Or here's why we couldn't make that change.
Oh, wow.
So they really went into depth, which I, as a member of the vendor community, I really appreciate. Like, what is the logic behind some of the decisions you're making? They didn't just throw a new set of T's and C's out there. They gave you the play-by-play for like what changes they made and what changes they didn't make and why they couldn't make those changes. So I thought it's been a long time coming, but I thought it was really handled pretty well the way that they rolled it out.
Okay, so policy is so important, but it's like so much of life, it's ultimately about people. Who are the people involved in producing these regs that got such that are getting such a warm reception in the vendor community?
It's those attorneys,
Okay.
which, surprise, like we were happy with how attorneys handled something. So the Department of Technology and the Department of General Services worked hand in hand on this. Their attorneys were the ones that were basically going line by line, sticking point by sticking point, and working through this. And then they worked with the vendor community pretty closely. And it wasn't just one vendor. They're not, making this fit for Intel, but not for HP.
Right.
We were in the room. There were dozens of vendors, big, small, resellers, products, hardware, software. So these terms apply really broadly. It's everything IT, whether it's cloud, the version 1 cloud, or version 2 not cloud. They apply to everything, and it's effective immediately. So
I picked up on a subtle distinction in your response, but you talked about DGS and CDT working so well together. For years, there's been over the years at different times, there's been aggressive hostility between CDT and DGS, and it gets papered over sometimes. But the departments there can be some tension. I think, and we've talked a lot to a lot of different people, but with Secretary Tong's elevation and her CDT roots, and then the current leadership at CDT, they're really on the same page deeply, to where they're engaged at lower level hiring decisions together. And I don't know that everybody is singing from the same sheet of music, but it's hard to find a bunch of dissent, and they're certainly not shooting at each other, which has not always been the case. Maybe that's played into how they were able to get on the same page on a significant regulatory rewrite.
I mean, they really have come a long way, and it is a unique problem in California. Like, very rarely is technology procurement in an entirely different department than the rest of procurement. And it's been a tug of war back and forth between the departments for decades, if not longer. And so I do feel like they've finally reached a place where they're working from the same page, the same team. I mean, they put on a quarterly vendor forum, and it's joint. It's a joint vendor forum for CDT and DGS because they are really functioning as one team, which is great because that's what the public expects. That's what the citizens expect. That's what the vendor community expects. Like, when I have to break down how technology procurement works in California to someone, they're like, what? that
Right.
doesn't make any sense. And it's like, you don't need to worry about it. Like, they function pretty much as the same team. They just have different email endings to their addresses.
Well, I want to go back more to some of the substance of the regulation, but you talked about combining the three into one. I think it was
SaaS Pass.
SaaS Pass and Cloud.
Yep.
And so now it's combined into one, and it's either cloud or not cloud, and you get these conditions or those. What impact do you think that'll have in the procurement process?
It just makes things a lot more clear and easier. Like, I don't think they're perfect. That was sort of my summary to clients. It's like, it's not perfect, and contracting with California is still really difficult. And you're going to see different versions of these out there everywhere. But now there's less confusion, right? It's pretty straightforward. They also added some other stuff in there that I think is important for people to keep an eye on. So they added a new section regarding a contractor's liability for their subcontractors for their performance and their work under a contract. So it really is like one throat to choke, in that the prime contractor on any deal is fully responsible for their subcontractors.
Ooh.
I think this is because we've run into some instances where it's like, it's not us, it was them. They're a subcontractor. And it's like, no, but you're the prime. Like, our contract is with you. You're responsible for dealing with all of your, herding of cats happening behind the scenes. So interesting there to see that. And then another acknowledgement and clarification around reseller arrangements between contractors and service providers. So, like, if I'm buying a product and someone is reselling it and there is service being provided, and we've talked about this on previous episodes, right? Like, where does the liability lie in that type of agreement? So there is more clarification on that. They basically strongly encourage resellers to pass down terms, responsibilities to those, to the manufacturers, but they hold short of requiring the manufacturers to actually agree to the terms and conditions. So
the reseller will still be fully on the hook, but strongly encouraged to pass those along to the OEMs.
Yep.
And that will probably facilitate lots of conversations between resellers and OEMs. And will it impact how the state is viewing the agreements? Do they care deeply about what that arrangement is, or is it?
I think as long as they get someone to sign, that's enough for them. Okay. As to your business arrangements behind that signature, it's up to you, right? Like, it's a little bit of like, we realize there's a risk, but there's so much work involved in that we're just going to accept that as a risk.
Well, I appreciate the overview. I think the audience will have gotten a lot out of that. As we wrap up, are the terms and conditions, your salesperson that is dealing with a state agency, do they need to read the terms and conditions, be very familiar with that, or is that?
They're probably not even going to understand 90% of it. Like, my message to clients was, pass this on to your legal team, pass this on to your contracts team, your compliance team, because those guys are going to read it. They're going to be held responsible after the sale, after the contract is inked, to actually comply with them. I mean, the other thing that I think is important for sort of everyone to remember is that, this also, the state doesn't accept red lines to this. Like, this is it. We're not changing this. You accept or you don't accept. And if you don't accept, go somewhere else to do business. So I hear that all the time. No problem. We'll just redline it. And I'm like, no. Like, redlining, redlining doesn't exist in the state. This is the base terms and conditions. Where you might have some flexibility is in the statement of work. So, like, that's how we've gotten around unlimited liability in cyber in the past. And when you read through these terms and conditions, you'll see, like, unless otherwise stated in the SOW. And like, that's the key word where like, okay, this one might be open for negotiation because, you know, this is where you start. This is the starting line and things can be negotiated. But if they are going to negotiate it, it has to be in the scope of work. You're not redlining anything here.
I already gave the summary, but you raised such a great question that I can't let it go. You can't negotiate something contradictory in the scope of work that contradicts the general terms and conditions, right? So your flexibility is limited in the scope of the work, but you can get really creative and get lawyers comfortable in a defensible space that's not in conflict. Is that
Correct.
how we think about it?
Like the scope of work is not for the state to assume more risk. It's for them to assume less. So generally, like this being the starting point, it only gets more restrictive in the scope of work. But I have seen instances where they're like, don't worry about that. We can arrange something in the scope of work
That'll get you comfortable.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, and maybe that's the perfect way to end this. What this is ultimately about is a path forward for both sides to get comfortable, to know what their rights and responsibilities are, and we have a new set of rules.
Simplified, easier to understand set of rules.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your expertise, Jen. I hope the audience got something out of it.
Thanks.